Do you think that it's possible to define any kind of a characteristic in the human animal that causes this mindless, blind pillaging? It's possible to see what motivates those without any sense of environmental integrity, who are really motivated more and more by the desire for power and money. But what about the Joe Sixpacks of the world, who operate the bulldozers? Where do you think the problem lies there?
I do not think it lies with the Joe Sixpacks. I've been a Joe Sixpack for much of my life. Had to work at various jobs, most of them rather tedious, simply to get by, make a living. No, I certainly don't blame working people. They're more victimized by this process than the rest of us. Most of them have their lives and their health threatened more directly and more constantly simply by the work they do than we lucky ones who can talk about it all. That's a tough question you raise. I find it hard to say where this disease began. It really does seem to me like a kind of cancer, a tumor on human society. I would say it began when we gave up the traditional hunting and gathering way of life and made the terrible mistake of settling down to agriculture. Somebody has said that the plow may have done more damage to human life and the planet than the sword. I'd be inclined to think that might be true. And agriculture was followed by industrialism, which began only about 200 years ago, and the new way of looking at the world invented by a few European philosophers and scientists, which seemed quite thrilling and liberating at first, and it still could be, but has had this offshoot. Well, they discovered the means, the ability to achieve mastery over nature. And here we come back to human nature again, don't we? Once we discover we have this ability to push things around or push other people around, most humans do not have the self-control to refrain from using that power. Power corrupts, as some wise man said. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Science and technology are gradually giving us this absolute power over the rest of life and human life. And power not only corrupts, but it attracts the worst elements of human life. Power attracts the worst and corrupts the best. Hard to say. Humans have always wanted to achieve some sort of control of their environment. Not only we moderns, but the most ancient tribes practice their magic and their rituals in the effort, at least, of bringing things under some control so they'd be able to predict what was going to happen, and for the perfectly honorable purpose of surviving. But somehow in the last 5,000 years, this normal, natural, healthy, wholesome desire to survive and continue human life, raise a family, pass your genes on to succeeding generations, has been corrupted by the desire not merely to live a sane and harmonious and beautiful life, but to dominate, to achieve power. And we mentioned this before. We began by enslaving one another. The first industrial systems, really, were those of Egypt, I suppose, and Mesopotamia, and maybe ancient China, where thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions were conscripted into work gangs of one sort or another to build these huge monuments to the glory of some tyrant. The pyramids of Egypt, the Great Wall of China. Society itself became a kind of machine. As Lewis Mumford pointed out, the original great machines were made of human bodies, flesh and bone. They were slaves, human slavery. That was probably the original evil. So for thousands of years, our society has depended on the enslavement of most humans. Either simple chattel slavery like that of the blacks in America, or the slightly more subtle form of slavery, serfdom in Europe, peasants and the lords, and the modern form of slavery we call wage slavery, chaining people to routine tasks, whether in a factory, or in a store, in an office, forcing them, compelling them to perform tedious, dull, repetitious work in order to eat. And even when they're well paid, living in suburban houses with thousands of dollars worth of gadgets and a car and a pickup truck and a motorboat, and so forth. Most of us are still slaves to the system. We're dependent upon it. We cannot break free from it. We have to support it and work for it, or they'll cut us off and we'll starve. Slavery, a great evil. We enslaved some of our fellow beasts, the horse, the burro. We created the mule, made slaves of dogs. And then soon afterwards we learned to enslave human beings. And now our technological industrial machine is trying to enslave the whole of nature. Put everything to work for human greed and power. That, I think, is the great evil of human life, modern life. By modern, I mean the last 5,000 years, when the nightmare of history began.
Science is not sufficient. Ecology is a word I first read in H.G. Wells 20 years ago, and I still don't know what it means, or seriously much care. Nor am I primarily concerned with nature as a living museum, the preservation of spontaneous plants and wild animals. The wildest animal I know is you, gentle reader, with this helpless book clutched in your claws. No, there are better reasons for keeping the wild wild, the wilderness open, the trees up and the rivers free, and the canyons uncluttered with dams. We need wilderness because we are wild animals. Every man needs a place where he can go to go crazy in peace. Every Boy Scout troop deserves a forest to get lost, miserable, and starving in. Even the maddest murderer of the sweetest wife should get a chance for a run to the sanctuary of the hills, if only for the sport of it, for the terror, freedom, and delirium, because we need brutality and raw adventure, because men and women first learn to love in, under, and all around trees, because we need for every pair of feet and legs about 10 leagues of naked nature, crags to leap from, mountains to measure by, deserts to finally die in when the heart fails. The prisoners in Solzhenitsyn's labor camps looked out on the vast Siberian forests. Within those shadowy depths lay the hope of escape, of refuge, of survival, of hope itself. But guns and barbed wire blocked the way. The citizens of our American cities enjoy a high relative degree of political, intellectual, and economic liberty. But if the entire nation is urbanized, industrialized, mechanized, and administered, then our liberties continue only at the sufferance of the technological mega-machine that functions both as servant and master. And our freedoms depend on the pleasure of the privileged few who sit at the control consoles of that machine. What makes life in our cities at once still tolerable, exciting, and stimulating is the existence of an alternative option, whether exercised or not, whether even appreciated or not, of a radically different mode of being out there, in the forests, on the lakes and rivers, in the deserts, up in the mountains. Who needs wilderness? Civilization needs wilderness. The idea of wilderness preservation is one of the fruits of civilization, like Bach's music, Tolstoy's novels, scientific medicine, Novocaine, space travel, free love, the double martini, the secret ballot, the private home and private property, the public park and public property, freedom of travel, the Bill of Rights, peppermint toothpaste, beaches for nude bathing, the right to own and bear arms, the right not to own and bear arms, and 1,000 other good things one could name, some of them trivial, most of them essential, all of them vital to that great, bubbling, disorderly, anarchic, unmanageable diversity of opinion, expression, and ways of living, which free men and women love, which is their breath of life, and which the authoritarians of church and state and war and sometimes even art despise and always have despised and feared. A permissive society? What else? I love America because it is a confused, chaotic mess, and I hope we can keep it this way for at least another 1,000 years. The permissive society is the free society, the open society. Who gave us permission to live this way? Nobody did. We did. And that's the way it should be, only more so. The best cure for the ills of democracy is more democracy. The boundary around a wilderness area may well be an artificial, self-imposed, sophisticated construction. But once inside that line, you discover the artificiality beginning to drop away. And the deeper you go, the longer you stay, the more interesting things get, sometimes fatally interesting. And that too is what we want. Wilderness is and should be a place where, as in Central Park, New York City, you have a fair chance of being mugged and buggered by a shaggy fellow in a fur coat, one of Pooh Bear's big brothers. To be alive is to take risks. To be always safe and secure is death. Enough of these banalities, no less true anyhow, which most of us embrace. But before getting into the practical applications of this theme, I want to revive one more argument for the preservation of wilderness, one seldom heard, but always present, in my own mind at least, and that is the political argument. Democracy has always been a rare and fragile institution in human history. Never was it more in danger than now, in the dying decades of this most dangerous of centuries. Within the past few years alone, we have seen two more relatively open societies succumb to dictatorship and police rule, Chile and India. In all of Asia, there's not a single free country except Israel, which, as the Arabs say, is really a transplanted piece of Europe. In Africa, obviously going the way of Latin America, there are none. Half of Europe stagnates under one man or one party domination. Only Western Europe and Britain, Australia and New Zealand, perhaps Japan, and North America can still be called more or less free, open, democratic societies. As I see it, our own nation is not free from the danger of dictatorship, and I refer to internal as well as external threats to our liberties. As social conflict tends to become more severe in this country, and it will unless we strive for social justice, there will inevitably be a tendency on the part of the authoritarian element, always present in our history, to suppress individual freedoms, to utilize the refined techniques of police surveillance, not excluding torture, of course, in order to preserve not wilderness, but the status quo, the privileged positions of those who now so largely control the economic and governmental institutions of the United States. If this fantasy should become reality, and fantasies becoming realities are the story of the 20th century, then some of us may need what little wilderness remains as a place of refuge, as a hideout, as a base from which to carry on guerrilla warfare against the totalitarianism of my nightmares. I hope it does not happen. I believe we will prevent it from happening. But if it should, then I, for one, intend to light out at once for the nearest national forest, where I've been hiding cases of peanut butter, home brew, ammunition, and sea rations for the last 10 years. I haven't the slightest doubt that the FBI, the NSA, the CIA, and the local cops have dossiers on me a yard thick. If they didn't, I'd be insulted. Could I survive in the wilderness? I don't know. But I do know I could never survive in prison. It seems to me that Keats was wrong when he asked rhetorically, "Do not all charms fly at the mere touch of cold philosophy?" The word philosophy standing in his day for what we now call physical science. But Keats was wrong, I say, because there is more charm in one mere fact, confirmed by test and observation, linked to other facts through coherent theory into a rational system, than in a whole brainful of fancy and fantasy. I see more poetry in a chunk of quartzite than in a make-believe wood nymph, more beauty in the revelations of a verifiable intellectual construction than in whole misty empires of obsolete mythology. The moral I labor toward is that a landscape as splendid as that of the Colorado Plateau can best be understood and given human significance by poets who have their feet planted in concrete data, and by scientists whose heads and hearts have not lost the capacity for wonder. Any good poet, in our age at least, must begin with the scientific view of the world, and any scientist worth listening to must be something of a poet, must possess the ability to communicate to the rest of us his sense of love and wonder at what his work discovers. The canyon country does not always inspire love. To many it appears barren, hostile, repellent, a fearsome land of rock and heat, sand dunes and quicksand, cactus, thorn bush, scorpion, rattlesnake, and agoraphobic distances. To those who see our land in that manner, the best reply is, yes, you're right. It is a dangerous and terrible place. Enter at your own risk. Carry water. Avoid the noonday sun. Try to ignore the vultures. Pray frequently. For a few others, the canyon country is worth only what they can dig out of it and haul away, to the mills, to the power plants, to the bank. For more and more of those who now live here, however, the Great Plateau and its canyon wilderness is a treasure best enjoyed through the body and spirit, in situ, as the archaeologists say, not through commercial plunder. It is a regional, national, and international treasure too valuable to be sacrificed for temporary gain, too rare to be withheld from our children. For us, the wilderness and human emptiness of this land is not a source of fear, but the greatest of its attractions. We would guard and defend and save it as a place for all who wish to rediscover the nearly lost pleasures of adventure not only in the physical sense, but also mental, spiritual, moral, aesthetic, and intellectual adventure. A place for the free. Here you may yet find the elemental freedom to breathe deep of unpoisoned air, to experiment with solitude and stillness, to gaze through 100 miles of untrammeled atmosphere, across red rock canyons, beyond blue mesas, toward the snow-covered peaks of the most distant mountains, to make the discovery of the self in its proud sufficiency, which is not isolation, but an irreplaceable part of the mystery of the whole. Come on in. The earth, like the sun, like the air, belongs to everyone and to no one.